Welcome to the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show with Corey and Justin. Here they are, the Fourth and Long Fantasy Brothers.
Welcome to episode 14 of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. My name is Corey, and I am here with my actual brother, Justin.
Hello, this is Justin.
Justin, it's episode 14 coming in fast. We are approaching draft season, and as we approach draft season, the news is spinning. Justin, talk to me a little bit about Miles Sanders and the injuries that are going around right now.
Yeah, Corey, it's what they like to call around the industry hamstring season right now, right? We get into the throes of training camp and what would have been preseason games at this point. You've got a lot of guys coming up gimp in practice, whether it's with hamstring injuries, shoulder injuries, whatever it might be. One of the more noteworthy injuries that came out, which is something that I know you and I are both keeping an eye on, and really the collective fantasy community is the Miles Sanders news that came out around the lower body injury, the week-to-week designation given by the Philadelphia Eagles. I think it's the right call by the Eagles, right? I mean, you want to make sure you protect your star running back here. Sanders has a lot of upside in 2020, but it's something as a fantasy manager and as a fantasy player you have to consider. You're going to have a lot of news that comes out over the next week or so as you get prepared for your draft. I think it's important to be able to not overreact too much, right? Gather as much information as you can. If there are specific players that you're concerned about, like a guy like Miles Sanders, right? If you don't feel comfortable taking him at the end of the first, early second, that's completely fine. Move on, grab a guy like Joe Mixon, grab a guy like Kenyon Drake, grab a guy like Aaron Jones and move forward, right? Don't put yourself in a situation where you feel like you're taking on a risky asset that could potentially come back to bite you. Corey, I'm curious if you have any sort of tips, strategy, how you approach what they deem hamstring season here in the NFL.
Well, I mean, it's tough. It's flipping a coin, Justin, because there are some times when it's Amari Cooper and he deals with it for the rest of the season. And there's other times where it's Derrick Henry and he clearly does not deal with it for the rest of the season. So It's tough. It's really, really tough to tell. I'm going to say this in terms of Miles Sanders. Justin, you know how you have those guys who you just know you're not going to get during the fantasy season? Miles Sanders is one of those guys for me. I'm not going to get him. He's being valued way too high for me, and I'm not going to take him unless he falls into the third or fourth round. And if the injury news comes back even more and more concerning, he's going to fall even lower for me. So I'm not too worried about Miles Sanders. Trust in the talent that you have. Understand that it can sometimes be 50-50. And just know that injury is a part of the game, and hopefully it just doesn't bite you too hard.
Yeah, you got to stay fluid, got to stay optimistic, just try to gather as much information as you can. We're going to get into some draft strategies here as we get into the show here. And yeah, I think it's one of those things where you have to be able to part the news out, take in the information that you find valuable, and adjust your draft strategy from there.
And Justin, speaking of draft strategies, neither of us have avoid injury, but we have a lot of great tips for those of you who will be drafting either this weekend, next weekend, or in the weekends or weeks to come. So with that being said, let's get to it.
On today's show,
we have two major subjects this week and not a lot of time to go over them, so let's get right into it. To start things off, we're going to be sharing some draft day strategies we both abide by when it comes to a fantasy football draft, and we will then follow that up with 6 total, 3 each, Breakout Fantasy Stars for the 2020 fantasy season. Let's get things started with Justin sharing with us 3 draft day strategies he employs when in the midst of a fantasy football draft.
Yeah, so first and foremost, as we get into this topic here on draft day strategies, draft day in general is going to look a whole heck of a lot different for a lot of leagues this year, right? You're typically getting together with your buddies, maybe you're gathering at a at a restaurant, a bar, maybe it's somebody's house in their backyard. It's going to look a little different this year given the situation of the world these days. But I think most importantly, just remember to enjoy yourself and all of the preparation, all of the research, all of the analysis that you've been doing over the last number of weeks and months has led to this day. So just relish in it and enjoy it. Draft day really is one of the best days of the year. So I'll get us started with one of my first draft day strategies, and that is don't be a fool, be prepared. So as with anything in life, preparation is key, right? Routine is important when you're preparing for your draft day upcoming. Leading up to this moment, right? You should have been practicing. You should have been honing your craft. You should have been doing mock drafts, which are incredibly important, especially to understand ADP and, kind of where guys are going to be going at certain spots in the draft. It's really good to practice as much as you possibly can. Now, by the time draft day rolls around, you should have your rankings up to date. I personally like to have mine printed and ready to roll for my draft. You want to go in with a general strategy, not I'm going to pick this guy at this pick, more I'm going to wait on quarterback, or I want to secure 2 top flight running backs with my first 2 picks. You should really go in with just a general strategy that you can try to abide by. But man, I love showing up on draft day, getting a comfy spot on the couch, cracking a cold beer, and drafting my squad. It's the best day of the year. Draft strategy number 2, stay fluid. Don't put yourself in a box. Now, truth is, we just don't know what's going to happen on draft day, right? We go in with a general idea of how it's going to unfold, but there's going to be those dudes who either draft a quarterback in the first round or even worse, draft 3 straight tight ends. But the biggest thing is to just kind of take the draft as it unfolds, right? Stay fluid, stay optimistic, stay as open to shifting and modifying your pre-draft strategy as you can. Go into the draft with a general idea of how you want to construct your team, but don't treat it as the end-all, be-all. If you go in with a general strategy of, let's say, I want to wait on quarterback, right? I'm going to take one of my last picks this year is going to be a quarterback. I'm not going to go with a guy like Mahomes or Jackson or Watson or Wilson, one of those earlier guys. I'm going to wait. Now, that's great. It's a good strategy to go in with. But if Mahomes is there in the 4th or 5th round, you might want to take him. So stay fluid. And then finally, my third draft day strategy will be to stay aware and stay engaged. So stay alert when you're at your draft, right? You want to make sure you follow how the draft unfolds. You want to stay aware of the guys picking around you, what they need versus what you need, and then adjust your strategy as appropriate. So let's say you're looking for a quarterback and you're picking towards the end of the round, and you realize that the 2 guys after you already have quarterbacks. It may not be a bad idea to skip quarterback for that pick, grab another wide receiver, grab another running back, and then let those other 2 teams pick another player, and then swing back and grab a quarterback with your next pick. So be aware of what's going on, be aware of the other individuals in your draft, and understand how the draft's going to unfold over the next couple picks. The other thing, too, is to not lose focus as you start to move into the mid to later rounds, right? Fatigue starts to set in. You've, had a few cold ones. You've had your fair share of snacks at your draft party. And, someone may have destroyed something at your draft party, maybe a coffee table. I don't know. Don't let that impact you. Stay engaged, stay focused. Drafts are often won in the double-digit rounds, so you want to make sure you keep your sheet up to date as you're going through it. Plan ahead and walk away with no regrets. Corey, what you think?
Yeah, so I'll just echo the fact that fantasy drafts are going to look different this year without a doubt. And I will say the coffee table industry, repair industry, is certainly not going to be used as much this year because, I know most drafts are going to probably be happening over Zooms and other conferencing software. So I like those strategies, Justin. They definitely sort of have a general assessment of be prepared but be flexible. And you're going to hear a lot of the same with what I'm coming at with. Well, here I'm going to start with my first draft strategy, which is to zig where others are going to zag, right? So you're going to hear me pick on these guys a couple times today, and I don't mean to, but Austin Eckler or Derrick Henry at the swing because you need 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds? No, thank you. That's not me. I'll take Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill and assume the wide receivers will go back to normal. And by that, I mean not as volatile as last year. The reason why people are telling you to take Austin Eckler and Derrick Henry in that first round or at the swing is because wide receivers were just so crazy last year. And for some reason, running backs were more bankable last year than wide receivers were. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to continue. As a matter of fact, that's not been the thing for the previous 5 years of fantasy where wide receivers were bankable and running backs were all over the place. George Kittle or Travis Kelce in the first 2 rounds because you're not going to get them otherwise, I'm going to pass unless I can get them in the 4th, all right? When has taking a tight end in the first 2 rounds ever really been the best plan in fantasy anyways, right? Even in the days of Gronkowski, he was so on one year, off another year that didn't always work out for people. And, taking the best available talent and buck the trend of what is in fashion this year is really what I will recommend. I'll say it again. Take the best available talent and buck the trend of what is in fashion. Fantasy football is pretty fickle year to year. You don't need to do anything. Don't let anyone tell you you need to do something. You just need to get the best players on your roster. Period. End of sentence. Move forward.
Amen.
Draft strategy number 2 is going to be talent over situation, to a point. I don't like him, but it looks like he's going to be the starting running back. Oh, yeah? Well, how'd that work out for Peyton Barber? Wait, but he's quarterback X's number 2 target, and quarterback X always has a good number 2 target. Well, how'd that work out for Valdez-Scantling or Geronimo Allison in Green Bay last year? Tight ends do great in Coach X's system. He loves to use his tight ends. Well, how'd that go in Dallas last year? Look, situations matter. I'm not here to downplay that, but not nearly to the extent we often make it seem. And yes, talent can get buried for dumb reasons. So I'm not dismissing situation, but at the end of the day, the fantasy cream seems to always rise to the top. So focus on talent over situation when you can. And then my final draft strategy is going to be the 1+ full season rule. What do I mean by this? Well, CJ Spiller, Jeremy Hill, Peyton Hillis, and the list goes on and on and on. And if you don't know those names, no one's going to blame you, because those are guys who flashed for 3 to 4 months in the previous year and then became first-round picks the next year. So I want to say, I speak from experience on this one. Do not waste a top draft pick on something you haven't seen over time. Are there exceptions? Of course there are. Transcendent rookies, for example, come to mind. Yes, I would have taken Saquon or Zeke in the first round of their rookie year. I will say, however, normally I'm not as bullish as others, even in those situations. I'm not going to be. I'll be honest. I was not going to take Saquon or Zeke with a top 5 pick. Would have definitely taken them at the swing. But the point is like, yes, I'm going to miss out on those guys, but I'm going to miss out on those guys because most of the time those CJ Spillers and Jeremy Hills and Peyton Hillises of the world, they're more often the situation that you find yourself in. So look, you believe Derrick Henry has turned it around and has 85-yard runs in him every single week. Okay, it can happen, right? We saw it happen last year. I'm just not willing to place my chips on that because those runs didn't exist for him a year and a half ago. You think Austin Eckler is the next PPR running back monster? All right, sounds good. Let me know how that goes for you. I hope he is. He's fun to watch, but he also gets random fourth quarter 75-yard touchdowns to save your week like he's addicted to it. You won't see me going with the risky picks early on. Give me the stability. Give me the proven results. I'd rather go down with the devil I know than the devil I don't, Justin.
Yeah, and I think one of the prime examples of this last draft strategy you just went through is Clyde Edwards-Helaire this year, right? I mean, the guy's going in most mock drafts, the end of the first round, beginning of the second round. This is a guy who has not played a single snap in the NFL, right? I'd much rather have a guy like Joe Mixon, Kenyon Drake. I'd much rather have guys that have already shown that they can hang in the NFL. I think the other thing, Corey, too, was the first strategy you went through around zigging where others zag. You can't put a whole bunch of stock in what happened last year and expect it to be the same this year, right? That's what we call recency bias in fantasy football.
Yep, that's exactly it, and that's why that's there. So, all right, Justin, those are our strategies, but now let's move into the second part of our show, which is Breakout Stars for the 2020 fantasy football season. In this segment, we are going to pinpoint players who will be exceeding expectations, jumping tiers, and winning fantasy leagues for teams this season like they never have before. These aren't exactly sleepers because there's going to be some names in here that you will recognize. There are some great examples of this in 2019 would be guys like Kenyon Drake, Kenny Golladay, Darren Waller, and Lamar Jackson. These guys were fantasy assets before the year, so they weren't really sleepers, but they ended up having such great years that they ended up turning it around for teams. All those guys that I talked about went from meh picks to fantasy darlings throughout the 2019 season. So I'm going to get us started with my first prediction of who will be a fantasy breakout in 2020, who's going to be the next Kenyon Drake or Golladay or Darren Waller or Lamar Jackson. And that's a guy that I've been talking about since we started this show in May, and that's Ronald Jones. Now, this is obviously less bold these days compared to when I was touting this guy back in May when the drafting of Keyshawn Vaughn meant his career was over. Now, the fantasy community has woken up a bit on what this guy can be, and some will believe his elevation in the ranks is something to be wary of. But I'm telling you, he's still a value. The coach speak has been overwhelmingly positive for Rojo, right? He's been saying again and again, this is the guy. And it's been overwhelmingly negative for the others, right? McCoy is here to mentor, he said. Vaughn can be a kick returner, he said. It's been kind of crickets on Dare Ogunbowale. So combine that with the obvious talent that this guy has, and you combine that with an awesome opportunity, and this guy's going to be considered the Darren Waller of last year. The guy that people will be saying, we should have listened at around the midseason point. I see him as a rock-solid RB2 with upward mobility if the touchdowns break right. I've spoken about his talent in tape before. We don't need to go over it again. Just know he will elevate your team. As long as he doesn't start going in the third or fourth round, I'm going to be investing in him, but I don't see that happening, Justin.
Yeah, Rojo is a definite value this year. He fits the criteria exactly. You know, when you're looking at a breakout player, a guy that could really break out onto the scene here, I think Rojo is one of those guys that could be a very consistent RB2 with those RB1 weeks sprinkled in. We know, Corey, being Patriot fans, of Brady's ability to really prop up his running backs and make them extremely fantasy relevant, especially in the pass game. Rojo's got a lot of upward mobility. I think it's a great breakout call. I like it, Corey. So I'll get us started with my first breakout, and that's going to be Hunter Renfrow, the second-year wideout for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, Renfrow was quiet up until week 8 last year, but from week 8 forward, the dude was really solid. He played 7 of the final 10 games. He did miss a couple games in there towards the end of the season, but he did play 7 of the final 10. And he actually averaged 15 points per game in PPR formats. Man, that's solid. And then on top of that, the final 2 weeks of the season, he put up a pair of 100-yard games with a score in each. Talk about production there. That's great. Now we know Derek Carr, the quarterback for the Vegas Raiders here, he loves throwing the ball short, and that's where Renfrow feasts. Renfrow's ADOT, his average depth of target, was only 7 yards. And that's really Carr's bread and butter, who loves to keep the ball close to the line of scrimmage. Now, Renfrow's currently going undrafted, and I think he deserves to be a part of your draft day squad. He's one of my favorite last pick guys, especially in PPR leagues. He'll get you that 5-catch, 60-yard game, and he'll sprinkle in a TD every couple games as well. I'll take that solid production at the end of my bench. And I think people will start looking at him as the next Julian Edelman type talent in 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, so Justin, if that's the case, then he's going to start becoming more of like a 4th, 5th rounder, especially in PPR leagues. And yeah, that would be a breakout right there, especially considering that he is not going in drafts or going very late in drafts this year. So my next fantasy breakout is going to be a quarterback, and it's a quarterback with a last name, no matter how much I try, Justin, I can never get right. So I'm going to need your help. It's Tua
Tagovailoa.
Thank you so much. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to say that even on the show. Listen, nothing but positive news here. He seems to be ahead of the curve, and the concept of the job being turned over to him around midseason seems very likely now. So remember the year when Colin Kaepernick came onto the 49ers and ultimately became a scary quarterback to face in fantasy? That's what I'm seeing for Tua this year. Look, it's a dart throw, and this shouldn't cost you anything on draft day. I'm not even saying to draft him unless you're in a dynasty league. But the second you hear murmurs of him getting the job, grab him. He, to me, is the next heir apparent in the group of Russell Wilsons and Kyler Murrays of the fantasy world. Now, look, Justin, this is probably my riskiest take, but it's one that I'm willing to bank on because of the positive vibes surrounding this guy's situation.
Corey, I like the call on Tagovailoa. I think he could very well have that Dolphins starting job here come, week 4, maybe week 5, maybe even earlier. I don't really know. I remember when Tagovailoa came in 2018 and won the job over Hurts at Bama. Man, he never looked back. I always liked the lefty throwing quarterback in Tua here. I think he's got a really bright future for the Dolphins. I like the call, man. It's a great one.
Forget it. I'll never get it. Go ahead, Justin. Your next breakout star.
So I'll get us going with my next breakout player. And my next breakout player is going to be Allen Lazard from the Green Bay Packers. Now, I was convinced that the Packers would add more offensive weapons this offseason to complement Aaron Rodgers. I think the entire fantasy community kind of really expected them to add some firepower to that offense. Well, instead, they went out and drafted players in the NFL draft at positions of strength they already had. They grabbed Jordan Love and A.J. Dillon with their first 2 picks. Scratch my head now, may not be saying the same thing in a couple years. The only real notable addition they made to the wide receiver core was Devin Funchess, who actually ended up opting out of the season. That leaves Adams as the clear number 1. and Lazard as the pretty clear number 2 in this Packers offense. Now, Lazard stands at a towering 6'5", comes in at 225 pounds. He is literally built just like Mike Evans. The guy is a beast at the wide receiver position. He was a real Cinderella story last year for the Packers. He was an undrafted player who didn't even make the final roster before the season last year. He was signed to the practice squad for the Packers and then was promoted to the active roster prior to week 1. Now, it did take him some time, which, is to be expected with an undrafted guy who didn't even make the roster, but he really started to emerge after the first 4 to 6 weeks of the season. One of the biggest things he did was he earned Rodgers' trust. We know that's so incredibly important, especially for a veteran quarterback. Rodgers followed that up with a lot of confidence in Lazard. He had a completion percentage of over 67 and a passer rating of over 115 when he was targeting Lazard in the passing game. Not only that, but Lazard came through with big plays in clutch situations. Now, Lazard is going undrafted in most leagues, but I think he could very easily see 100 targets in 2020. He has the opportunity to break out this year and become a real solid contributor for years to come.
Yeah, so Justin, rather than think that Green Bay doesn't know what they're doing because they didn't draft a wide receiver, maybe it speaks more to how much faith they have in Lazard. So I think people might be jumping the gun by saying there's not going to be a wide receiver 2 in this offense. I got to be honest, Lazard impressed me last year, even though we only saw him for a short amount of time.
Yeah, and I know that Aaron Rodgers is not the same quarterback, at least production-wise, that he was back a couple years ago, but he's sustained 2 fantasy-relevant wide receivers in years past. I don't see any reason why he can't do it with both Adams and Lazard in 2020.
Yep, I agree, which leads into another potential wide receiver 2 on his team that I'm really thinking could move into a wide receiver 1 type position. And I know that's a bold statement, and it's a bold statement that I'm saying about Dionte Johnson. Now, look, we're not willing for some reason to give OBJ, T.Y. Hilton, or Keenan Allen a pass for some pretty crappy quarterback play, but we're willing to do it for Juju for some reason, right? For all those other guys, it's their fault, but for Juju, it's his quarterback's fault. This year, I found myself a Smith-Schuster skeptic, and I'm abiding by the he needs to show me again rule before I pick him in anything earlier than the 6th round. What does that mean? I'm wondering if someone else assumes the number 1 role in Pittsburgh. Not immediately, but certainly over the season. Enter the question, Johnson or Washington? And I'm going to go Johnson here. We haven't seen much from him, but I believe he can do more than Washington. Washington profiles to me as more of a 1 or 2 trick pony, while Johnson has been given the opportunity to do more. So if Pittsburgh can reclaim even just a sliver of its offensive consistency from 2 years ago, I'm excited to see what Johnson may be able to accomplish when given the chance to outshine the guy I am now very cautious of in Juju Smith-Schuster.
Corey, it's a good point around Juju, right? I mean, you look at a lot of the elite wide receivers in the NFL, and they continue to produce no matter the quarterback situation they have. It was definitely very telling that Juju struggled as much as he did last year with the lack of Ben Roethlisberger. I'll be very curious to see what Juju does in 2020. I think Dionte Johnson is primed to be a breakout player for the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2020. So I'm going to get into my last and final breakout player here. And this is a guy that I'm sure the collective fantasy community is very much aware of. There's been a lot of hype around this guy over the last number of months. That's going to be Jonathan Taylor, the 2nd round running back choice of the Indianapolis Colts. Now, Corey, the reason why I put him on this list, I could have picked some other guys that we've talked about in previous episodes, but we collectively haven't really talked about Taylor too much on this show. We've been spending our time on this show talking about other rookies like Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Cam Akers, who you know I'm high on. So I wanted to talk about Taylor a bit because I think he has the makings of a real breakout superstar here in the NFL, especially in his rookie season. I think he's an easy breakout pick. There are high expectations, but I think the guy has the tools and the situation to immediately vault into the top 5 or 7 at the position as early as this year. His athletic profile, the history here, really helps explain his domination of the NFL Combine. He had a freakish sub-4.4 40-yard dash, crazy for a guy that comes in at over 225 pounds. The other thing that I like about Taylor, and I've talked about this with even Cam Akers as well, is his age-adjusted production is super encouraging. No one is as decorated as Jonathan Taylor from his few years at Wisconsin in terms of running back accolades and awards. he'll have to continue to refine his craft, right? He's going to have to work on his pass catching, and he's got to fix that issue he had in the collegiate levels with fumbling. But I don't think that's something we should be concerned about. This guy is a freak, man. Taylor's that running back that has that hard hat mentality, right? He's going to grab his lunch pail. He's going to run the ball 20 to 25 times a game, and he's going to be home for dinner. I like that, man. He is built like a tree trunk. He's like a linebacker with the speed and agility to outrun safeties, man. I like it. Now, obviously, he's going to have to separate himself from Marlon Mack, which I don't think he'll have any issues with. You know, Mack's a good runner, but he's not in the same stratosphere as Taylor in terms of talent. He's just not. I'm sorry. And then Mack's contract's actually upped after this year. So it could be the Jonathan Taylor show in Indy as early as 2021 and beyond. Now, Taylor finds himself in one of the best situations for a young runner in football. It's a well-run organization with the Indianapolis Colts. They've got a great offensive line. Does it really get much better for a young player? It sounds like a match made in heaven in my mind. Now, my bet is that Jonathan Taylor breaks out, and we're actually going to be considering him in the first round of NFL fantasy drafts as soon as 2021.
Wow, I love it, Justin. That is an impressive take. I think Taylor is primed to be a breakout star. Definitely something to keep an eye on, and definitely 6 players that you should be aware of on draft day. So there we go, Justin. Those 6 players we believe in that will change the course of your fantasy season. That does it for this week's episode. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell. Download, follow, like, comment, whatever you have to do to show some support. I'm Corey.
And I'm Justin.
And this has been the 4th and Long Fantasy Football Show. See you next time.
Royalty-free music courtesy of Ben Sound. The views and opinions expressed on today's episode are that of the 4th and Long Fantasy Football Show. Remember to like and subscribe.